All right, we're all set. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second annual Judith S. Stein Lecture in Political Economy. I am Johanna Fernandez, Associate Professor of History at Baruch College, and I teach here at the Graduate Center. On behalf of the Department of History here at the Graduate Center, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Jonathan Stein, the brother of Judith Stein, and his wife, Judith Stein, who shares Judith's name. We thank them for joining us this evening, and we thank the Stein family for its generosity in making the Judith Stein yearly lectures possible. And Dr. Joel Allen, the chair of the History Department, is very disappointed at not being able to join us this evening. He has graciously organized this event alongside our department administrator, Marilyn Weber, and last year's acting department chair, Dr. Jonathan Sassy, was instrumental in putting this event in place just last year alongside a small committee of faculty and students. Judith Stein was Distinguished Professor of History at City College, a powerful thinker, intellectual, and historian of Black American history, 20th century US history, and political economy. You probably know that she taught at City College for 50 years and at the Graduate Center for many decades. We think that approximately 30 years. Judith Stein's books were widely celebrated because they were meticulously researched. Her analysis elucidated the topics she wrote about, and her arguments and political judgments were always delivered with cutting wit and sharp clarity. And I have to say that I admired her and her brilliance from afar. As a historian, she was committed to understanding and explaining how change is produced by the contests for power between the political classes and working people and their organizations, all in the context of the ongoing needs, priorities, and challenges of the economy. Her groundbreaking book, Pivotal Decade, is a meticulous and masterly analysis of monetary, fiscal, and trade policy under the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations that explains the rise of neoliberalism and offers powerful historical contexts for the recession of 2007, the culture wars, and the rise of neo-fascist forces in American society and around the world today. And that is an epic feat, to analyze economic policy in 3 administrations during this epoch of shift and transformation is just an incredible accomplishment. Her most recent book was published this year posthumously and was co-authored with Nelson Lichtenstein. And the title of that book, as many of you know, is A Fabulous Failure: The Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism. Stein's first book on Marcus Garvey, The World of Marcus Garvey, is another tour de force. Stein had a deep understanding of American history and the international contexts and forces within which the country and its economy developed. And in this book, she drills down on the elite social character of Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association and his Black Star Line. She charts developments in the shipping industry and pressures placed on small businesses by the epic expansions of the American economy in the early 20th century to show that Garvey's enterprises failed not merely because of mismanagement alone, but as a consequence of the pressures that international capitalism placed on small businesses like the Black Star Line. The political magnitude of this contribution cannot be overestimated. Through the writing of history, Judith Stein exonerated Marcus Garvey and exposed the campaign of persecution launched against him by a government intent on disfiguring those it perceived as a political threat. Judith Stein's acerbic political assessments were epic. Again, epic is what I have to say about Judith and her contribution to our understanding of America in the 20th century. And she was in good company among her brilliant friends, all of whom continue to be attentive to political economy and the centrality of class in their quest to understand and explicate history and the problems of our contemporary society. Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. is one of those brilliant friends, and especially a close friend to Judith, and he joins us this evening to give the second annual Judith S. Stein Lecture in Political Economy. And his talk is titled, "The Only Thing That Hasn't Changed Regarding Black Politics Since 1965 is How We Think About It." Why? Adolph Reed Jr. is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He has taught at Howard, Yale, and Northwestern universities, the University of Illinois at Chicago, and the New School for Social Research. He has been a Carnegie Corporation Scholar of Vision, a John J. McCloy 16 Visiting Professor at Amherst College, and the inaugural Scholar in Residence in the McKenna Center for Leadership at St. Francis Xavier University. Dr. Reed was featured international speaker at the invitation of the Minister of the Secretariat at the National Symposium broadcast live on Brazilian national television, marking the 10th anniversary of the Brazilian Presidential Secretariat for the promotion of racial equality in 2013. And he was keynote speaker at the 4th annual Labor Fest Hawaii Conference in Honolulu, Hawaii. He is the editor of Race, Politics, and Culture, critical essays on the radicalism of the 1960s. He's editor of Without Justice for All, The New Liberalism and Our Retreat from Racial Equality. And with Kenneth Warren, he is co-editor of Renewing Black Intellectual History, the Ideological and Material Foundations of African-American Thought. He's also the author of The Jesse Jackson Phenomenon, The Crisis of Purpose in Afro-American Politics, W.E.B. Du Bois and American Political Thought, Fabianism and the Color Line, Stirring in the Jug, Black American Politics in the Post-Segregation Era, Class Notes, which is a collection of his popular political writings, and most recently, The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives, which are ruminations on the last decades of the Jim Crow order. He is co-author with Walter Ben Michaels of No Politics But Class Politics. He's currently completing 2 books, You Can't Get There From Here, a critique of Black cultural studies with Kenneth Warren, and When Compromises Come Home to Roost, the decline and transformation of the US left. He has been a columnist in The Progressive, The Village Voice, and The New Republic, and has written frequently in The Nation, Dissent, onsite.org, of which he is an editorial board member, and many other academic and popular journals and magazines. He served on the board of Public Citizen Inc., and was a member of the Interim National Council of the Labor Party and the Executive Committee of the American Association of University Professors. And he is currently on the boards of Food and Water Action and the Debs Jones Douglas Institute, and is an organizer in that same institute's Medicare for All South Carolina campaign. He's a regular on that center's Class Matters podcast, which you can find at classmatterspodcast.org. Judith Stein is dancing in the streets wherever she is. She would be delighted to have Dr. Adolph deliver this address this evening. So please help me welcome him.
Hi. I guess the mic is working. You can hear me, right? Okay. And I'm going to take my watch off, which I hope will help me keep time, or at least buy me some time. Yeah, I want to thank everybody who was in whatever way responsible, both for organizing this lecture in general and for inviting me in particular. It is a great honor. I mean, Judith was indeed a very dear friend, and I tell you, like as I've anticipated it, I have been anxious about doing something that would be up to Judith's standard. And I mentioned that to my son, who had Judith on his dissertation committee, and he reminded me that her standard is, well, anything can always be better. So, and well, I'll say one other thing about that. When Judith and I met actually around Jesse Jackson, we were on a panel together at the Old Social Scholars Conference on the 1984 Jackson campaign, because my book was coming out and her book on the Garvey movement was coming out. And also, I guess I should make this announcement too. You probably all have them, but there's going to be a PSC rally for a living wage outside the Graduate Center on the 15th at 1 p.m. Right? I mean, be there or be square. All right, so yeah, the only thing that hasn't changed about Black politics since 1965 is how we think about it. Why? I've said for a while now that if there were a Pulitzer or even a Nobel Prize for apothegms, that one from political scientist Willie Leggett would win, because it identifies in the pithiest way possible the key and crucially unrecognized anomaly that characterizes both academic and popular discussion of Black American political life. And Judith Stein's work on Black politics, particularly in her field-shaping 1974-75 Science and Society article of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others, the political economy of racism in the U.S. Her defining the race 1890 to 1930, which originally appeared in Werner Solers' 1989 collection, The Invention of Ethnicity. Her study of the Garvey movement, the world of Marcus Garvey that Joanna mentioned, and her magisterial Running America could help equip us to resolve that anomaly. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. The landmark legislation of the mid-1960s, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, set the stage for the end of the Jim Crow segregationist regime that had ruled in the South since the beginnings of the 20th century, set the stage for the rise of Black-led governance in cities across the nation, and the incorporation of Black Americans into the highest levels of Democratic Party leadership, up to and including the presidency. Those victories led to greatly expanded structures of opportunity and upward mobility for Black Americans, including access to upper status occupations that previously had been nearly unattainable. Yet, as the current century has unfolded, an increasingly prominent narrative in discussion of Black politics, again, both academic and popular, has not only dismissed those victories as insignificant, but has insisted that slavery and or Jim Crow segregation remains singularly definitive of the status of blacks in American society. Early in this century, emergence of reparations talk it began a backward-looking turn in Black political discourse, or at least channeled it. A politics centered on a demand for reparations necessarily disattends from proximate sources of current inequalities and reduces them to props for an argument seeking to connect them to inequalities and injustice in the past. That turn condensed and propelled a way of characterizing Black inequality or disadvantage, according to which current disparities apparent in the distribution of good and bad outcomes in society, for example, poverty, income and unemployment, housing, health, wealth, and also in areas like educational attainment and interaction with the criminal justice system, derive most consequentially from race or racism, if not proximately, then ultimately as a legacy of white supremacy as institutionalized in slavery and the racial apartheid of Jim Crow. At the time, to critical observers, the fervor of reparations talk seemed curious, perhaps even approaching moral panic. In policy terms, it seemed like a dead end. When queried about my views on the issue, I responded by asking what I assumed to be a conversation-stopping question. How would it be possible to imagine putting together a coalition that could prevail on that issue as a political demand? That question generated no direct response in 2000 when I first posed it. Only attempts to change the subject. For example, most commonly a retort like, don't you believe Black Americans deserve compensation for injuries imposed by racial oppression? Or sophistries like, no one thought that abolition would succeed until it did. That was true in 2000 and it remains true today. I have asked the same question over and over ever since 2000 and have never received a straight answer to it, which suggests there's something going on. Originally, I assumed that a reparations enthusiast's failure to respond to the strategy question was a function of the fervor that envelops the newly faithful and can overwhelm concern with such mundane issues. Before long, it became clear, though, that the question of crafting a majoritarian political strategy was completely beside the point to them. Not simply because of ecstasy, but because building effective majorities has nothing at all to do with what constitutes politics for reparations activists and other race reductionists. That politics is a clientelist politics grounded on a model of racial elite brokerage that understands Black politics as an ongoing negotiation between racial leaders and the governing strata in the society to define and advance the interests of a Black American population considered for all intents and purposes to be civically mute. That politics, even in its most militant or contorted race nationalist expressions, for example, Afro-pessimism, is basically a petition politics that, not to put too fine a point on it, posits the ruling class as a source of effective political agency and therefore as its substantive constituency. And this marks the first point in this talk where we get at least a hint of Judith Stein's importance for those of us trying to make sense of Legette's anomaly. In Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others, Stein lays out a historically rich account grounded in a deep understanding of the political economic forces working on and within the Black American population in the South that generated the stratum that articulated this style of brokerage politics. Stein was not the first to discuss the processes of Black group and class formation out of which that stratum emerged. August Meyer's Negro Thought in America, 1880 to 1915, had examined the emergence of a stratum of professionals, business operators, and aspirants to careers in racial group uplift. Stein acknowledged Meyer's accomplishment, but noted that his account, which focused on attitudes and ideas, was not so much wrong as incomplete. She says, to understand Black history, one must examine the principal social forces affecting Black people concretely and in historical time. Because Blacks interacted dialectically with other workers and other social classes, the historian must analyze specific social and class relationships and not be satisfied with general statements about broad social changes as backdrops for Afro-American history. To understand the era of Booker T. Washington, one must first examine the whole pattern of social forces affecting Blacks after the Civil War, not only the racial manifestations. A discussion of these forces will elucidate the early political events, such as the Compromise of 1877 and the establishment of the white democracies in the South, the popular movements, and finally the disfranchisement and Jim Crow system at the beginning of the 20th century. It will also explain how these forces interacted with Black aspirations and produced a variety of responses, one of which was that associated with Booker T. Washington. Now, I've written elsewhere that Stein's approach to the study of Black politics marked a striking departure from interpretive conventions in the field, which since its origination during the decade or so after World War II had assumed its object of study to be the relation between the Negro, or later the Black American, as a singular, substantially undifferentiated entity, and either whites or America. Touré Reed describes her interpretive intervention succinctly, noting that she traced the tendency of American historians to reduce Black political movements to potted frameworks such as accommodation and militance, self-help and protest, to a reflexive reification of race. As Stein put it, students of African-American politics too often treat Black-led movements as mechanical successions of protests against racism and withdrawals into self-help, which functions to mystify race, divorcing racism from the concrete and complex experiences of social groups in particular circumstances. It's worth noting in this regard, parenthetically, really, but like anyone who's ever been in a class with me knows that the digressions will be coming. That of the group of scholars and commentators most publicly identified with the critique of race reductionist tendencies in contemporary Black politics, for example, in addition to myself and Touré Reed, Kenneth Warren, Preston Smith, Dean Robinson, Cedric Johnson, and Willie Leggett himself, just to name a few, all count Stein's essay as having contributed significantly to the formation of their core analytical perspective. Historian Michael Rudolph West, and I was trying to remember today, I should have reached out to him or to Barbara Fields, whether Judith was also an outside reader on Michael's dissertation. I think she was there, but I can't remember. But anyway, West has argued in The Education of Booker T. Washington, the politics of racial brokerage that emerged in the late 19th century is the origin of the idea of race relations. which was from the beginning a stand-in for democratic political participation, and which, as a conceptual deep structure, continues to plague how Americans think and talk about Black politics. Following West, I discussed the race relations ideas, foundations, and particulars elsewhere, but today I want to stress two of its problematic features that are seldom remarked. First, the original brokerage politics on which it was grounded was always a class politics. As West notes, in the race relations framework, interests and aspirations of politicians and ministers among Washington's first foils, workers and businessmen, parents and teachers would no longer need to be expressed by way of the normal, if potentially messy, institutional channels through which Americans settle their conflicts and competition. Instead, they would be mediated through the good offices of Negro leaders, ever mindful of where their mandate to lead comes from, and the requirement placed on them as a first principle to cement the friendship of the races. Now, race relations politics was articulated by that emerging stratum of professionals, intermediate functionaries, and aspirants in racialized systems of hierarchy that were in transition institutionally in the early 20th century in the United States as well as in the British colonies and in the West Indies and West Africa. Wait, I made a note to myself here, hold on. Yep. It's elaboration here. Yeah, Stein examined the parallels between the stratum that was coming into existence among Black Americans in that period, and similar strata within British, West African, and the West Indian colonies. The agendas of early 20th century Pan-Africanism, in fact, which arose from members of the stratum, centered literally on appeals for more substantial roles in colonial administration for civilized Blacks, including post-World War I calls for the former German colonies to be placed, as W.E.B. Du Bois put it, under the guidance of organized civilization with special administrative voice for the chiefs and intelligent Negroes among the 12.5 million natives of German Africa and the 12 million civilized Negroes of the United States. That's a quote from Du Bois, by the way. All right. Back to the main point. The sort of class politics that it was underwrote, or this stratum's sort of class politics underwrote its articulation as a race politics. That the material and ideological project around which the emergent stratum of Black putative race leaders took shape was, in Kenneth Warren's characterization, substitution of Black professionals, managers, and intellectuals for their white counterparts within those institutions charged with administering to the needs of the Black population, or more succinctly, the establishment of managerial authority over the nation's Negro problem within whatever political and economic relations prevailed. The effective allies to that project, as I've already noted, but the point bears of the repetition, were to be sought within the ruling class, which alone had the capacity to validate the race men and women's claims to speak for the Negro, and to mobilize the material the resources necessary to implement the stratum's top-down programs of cultural tutelage and uplift. And the emerging race leadership stratum converged around the conviction that race relations or race adjustment would be best realized through partnership with between the best elements of both races. That conviction, which also underlay the common lament that segregation prevented the better classes of blacks and whites from engaging one another, decreed a particular disposition toward the agenda of racial uplift. And I want to offer here a distinctively clear case in point. Anna Julia Cooper, now heralded as an early Black feminist, strikingly demonstrates the connection between the fin de siècle Black elites' racial theories, its uplift ideology, and opposition to working class political organization for Blacks. Cooper interpreted the basis of American race conflict through the lens of prevailing historical or neo-Lamarckian race theories that emphasized racial differences in character or ideals. She then argued that Blacks' contribution to America derived from such racial traits, including inborn respect for authority, inaptitude for rioting and anarchy, gentleness and cheerfulness as a labor, which will prove indispensable and invaluable elements in a nation menaced as America is by anarchy, socialism, communism, and skepticism poured in with all the jailbirds from Europe and Asia. That's a quote, by the way, but I'm not making it up. Later, in the same text, she confessed to a lack of sympathy for the workers suppressed in the 1892 Homestead, Pennsylvania steel struggle, the 8-hour day movement, or labor unions in general. She contended that her feelings arose from labor's ill treatment of Blacks, marshaling anecdotes and apocrypha to buttress her assertions. But at the same time, she expressed strong nativist and anti-immigrant sentiments, and also firmly maintained that philanthropy was to be the uplift enterprise's main source for material support. So the class program around which the brokerage stratum converged was crafted in racial terms because A, the period in which both the stratum and its program took shape, the last decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th, was the moment when the race idea seemed more powerful and commonsensically explanatory than at any other moment in the history of human society, before or since. And B, correspondingly, the systems of hierarchy within which the stratum was embedded and defined their objectives, British colonialism, and imposed white supremacy and the racial disfranchisement in the United States, were explicitly racialized. And there is no contradiction or anomaly in this class program's racial character. The precise point of race as an ideology is that it obscures and mystifies class agendas that are crafted within concrete material relations by displacing them onto nature. That's how race attained the verisimilitude of common sense in the first place. Historian Barbara Jean Fields captured the point exquisitely. She said, race became the ideological medium through which people posed and apprehended basic questions of power and dominance, sovereignty and citizenship, justice and right. And race discourse provides a surface camouflage that makes inequality in its most general form, the form that marks and distorts every aspect of our social and political life, hard to see, harder to discuss, and nearly impossible to tackle. So this is not to suggest that would-be race men and women have been insincere in their commitments to pursue the interests of the race. One of the things that ideology does is to harmonize the principles one wants to hold with what advances one's material interests. It produces sincerity and the appearance of consistency. Racist ideology was hegemonic at the time of the brokerage elite's emergence, and racial classification was hegemonic, was a central element of its identity as a stratum. There were race men and race women. Racial brokers' understandings of what perspectives and priorities condense the race's interests well, that's a weird moment. Have been shaped by their class position, their social location, both within the Jim Crow order and in the capitalist political economy more broadly. In fact, the inclination to reduce in fact, the inclination to reduce Black American life to its racial dimension is itself a class posture. As a discourse of political identification, race, like ethnicity and nationalism, all variants of the same phenomena, provides that surface camouflage, the Field Sisters note, that sustains a synecdochic mystification and illustration of what the Fields is called racecraft, that agendas that would concentrate specific material benefits on smaller, discrete populations simultaneously address the needs of larger, more diffuse ones. And as Warren agrees, this form of political action centered on the idea of leadership unelected, but presumably attuned culturally and spiritually to the needs and desires of the race as a whole, and on that basis, able to speak for all Blacks, became the prevailing racial ideology of the last century. The idea of race relations has been virtually naturalized as the idiom for thinking about equality across the board in the US. So Black clientelist politics, from its beginning, has been predicated on the conviction that a program that amounts to a racial trickle-down serves the best interests of the race. In the early 20th century, racial uplift ideology, deeply embedded in hegemonic race theory again, was the sleight of hand that justified that racial trickle-down. In the early 20th century, in the early 21st century, things are in some respects very different. The deferential and sometimes even obsequious tone of Washington has been swapped out for demands, and the demands are now for allyship rather than friendship, and for the allies to give up their fantasies of white saviorship. But the structure and in effect the appeal to ruling class and hence mainly white saviors remains the same. And the sleight of hand is not that different. Hegemonic underclass ideology presumes that non-elite Blacks are damaged and in need of special tutelage conducted via the role modeling ministrations of upper status racial brothers and sisters. And constant assertion, both directly and indirectly through incessant drip of disparity discourse, that all Black Americans are equally vulnerable to, for example, the horrors of police terror and killing, or the banality of microaggressions, feed the sense that race on some level endows Black people with a hive-like experience, which implies both the sense that blacks share a racial hive mind and a corollary, very important corollary, that a payoff to any one black person is eo ipso a payoff to all. So the class character of anti-racist clientelism is even more transparent than its fin de siècle progenitors. Its proponents can defend the assertion that racism is a fundamental determinant of life chances for Black Americans only via a sleight of hand that divests slavery and Jim Crow of their historical specificity as discrete systems of economic and social relations and construes them as almost incidental extrusions of a transcendent racism or white supremacy, or even more tendentiously in a devil theory positing that all human history has been driven by an ontological anti-Blackness, which is the core stance of Afro-pessimism. Having transmogrified material social relations right into attitudes, putative evidence that such attitudes persist supports assertions that nothing has changed since 1619 or 1919. It's telling that commitment to that argument subordinates providing concrete causal accounts of how current inequalities are thereby produced and reproduced to taxonomizing apparent racial disparities as instances of the workings of transhistorical racism and white supremacy. This perspective minimizes the significance of political economic changes since 1965, which is how we began, including also deindustrialization, the panoply of regressive policy developments that have been associated with neoliberalization, and the significance of marked increases in occupational income and wealth stratification among African Americans. And this also connects us back to some of Judith's later work. The point of this politics is not to identify and pursue strategies to attack inequalities or injustices affecting Black Americans, but to make certain that they are understood as stemming from an evanescent racism. And implication is that only inequalities that can be attributed to specifically racial sources are a proper matter for concern. You may recall that in Black political class responses to Bernie Sanders in both 2016 and the 2020, there was what's the adjective I'm looking for? A militant contention, right? That concerns like right to a job and a living wage, free public higher education, Medicare for all, were somehow matters that were not pertinent to Black people. And so here's only my second digression. But in both campaigns, I had multiple experiences where I had like encounters at one sort of gathering or another with Black audiences, Black groups or groups of Black people who asked why Bernie didn't try to appeal to Black people. And I swear, right, that this is not fabrication or the tricks of memory. But I responded the same in each of those encounters. And my response was to go down the campaign program, item by item, and say, oh, yeah, okay, well, isn't this, like if we won this, wouldn't Black and Hispanic people be the disproportionate beneficiaries? Now that I'm sure happened. But what I believe also happened was that I cannot recall, and I try to mark it in my mind, one encounter with working class Black people. And granted, the bulk of them I had was with union members, but still, not one encounter with working class Black people in which the result of that exercise was not, oh yeah, I see the point. When I had those encounters with the Black PMC, they would begrudgingly harump for something, but basically walked away like they were smelling something distasteful, right? But that small N, right? I mean, no more than 20, but a bunch of different cities. But anyway, combined with the central focus on addressing racial disparities within the existing capitalist hierarchy, those characteristics of contemporary anti-racism underscore the extent to which it's a class program. As white wealth and income are increasingly concentrated at the very top of the distribution, achieving parity along racial lines would do little to address, the economic insecurity of the disproportionately working class black population, which leads one to wonder, well, then how does the racial wealth gap become the most important issue for all Black Americans? How did the murder of George Floyd create a problem that eliminating the racial wealth gap could solve? Get to that in a sec. For example, despite repeated assertions that the racial wealth gap is the most pressing concern for the race, nearly 80% of that wealth gap is concentrated among the richest 10% of Blacks and the richest 10% of whites. And half of both Blacks and whites have the same amount of wealth. Zip, babka, ser, whatever way you want to put it. All the tortuous prattle in the world about how wealthy whatever numbers of Black individuals might have been absent, racial discrimination and exclusion, does not gainsay the reality that nearly half a century of neoliberal accumulation by dispossession, imposed with bipartisan political support, has more significantly intensified has more significantly intensified economic inequality and insecurity across the general U.S. population, among Blacks and non-Blacks alike. And it is not an idle quip that one of the clearest indications that a class politics is at work is denial by those advancing it that it is a class politics. As the Fields has pointed out, obscuring class contradictions is and always has been the fundamental work that race does. That applies to the idea of the racial wealth gap itself, which rests on a grand ideological mystification. It's like when you take a half step back, take a breath, and think about the construct. But it should make you go, what the hell's the matter with me? The extent of polarization of wealth and income nationally and within populations classified respectively as white and Black should indicate the folly of any such notions. But there is no Black wealth or white wealth, only wealth held by Black or white individuals and families or other entities. The differences in wealth between otherwise comparable Black and white individuals and households on the average, right, either median or mean, likely reflect, among a variety of factors, the effects of present or past discrimination or exclusion. There's no denying that. And in principle, racial wealth gap could be a shorthand characterizing those aggregate differences. But race reductionism, in conflating the distinction between race as a category of social classification and race as an organic group represents racial wealth as if it were owned collectively. This has been a conceptual failing of the wealth gap notion since its emergence in the 1990s. And it's gone unchallenged because the hegemony of race relations ideology has implanted as common sense understanding in American society the fundamentally racist reification of Black people as a unitary entity to which distinction between singular and plural does not apply. And race reductionists have an interest in perpetuating a sleight of hand that obscures the wealth gap's mystified character. Some time ago, I was on a Black nationalist inclined podcast whose host agreed that stratification by occupation and income is and the wealth among Black Americans is greater than among other populations classified by race or ethnicity, and at the bottom half of Blacks and whites alike have no wealth. Yet he insisted that the wealth gap framework holds because Blacks' collective wealth is much lower than whites. But of course, there is no Black collective wealth, just as there's no white collective wealth. It may be that habituation to positing Blacks as a singular entity makes it difficult to recognize that basic fact. If so, then I have a thought experiment. So let's imagine a white registered nurse down on her luck and in danger of eviction. And can we imagine that she would try to find a way to dip into, the collective pot of white wealth, right, to make her rent, or maybe send a text to Elon Musk, who has been white at least since 1945, to pitch in. And also, similarly, but the gentrification idea operates in current political discourse in another, or rather how it operates is another clear case in point of the fields as racecraft. The current discourse of gentrification is the product of an effort to represent a straightforward neoliberal political economic dynamic, right? Diversion of public resources to support privately appropriated rent intensifying redevelopment, that is regressive transfer, as a moralistic and a culturalist one. But defining gentrification as a project of displacement of populations depicted as indigenous obscures its source in market-driven policy and government support for upward redistribution, which undercuts serious efforts to challenge that dynamic. That mystification of political economic forces also sustains another significant and anti-popular evasion. As the primacy of market forces disappears into moralistic and racialized debate, the inclusion of nominal representatives of the group held to be adversely affected appears as a satisfactory compromise. Those representatives' racial or cultural status provides a halo that obscures the material dynamics driving the process and provides them with a form of capital, race as capital rather than racial capitalism, that facilitates market entry and market penetration for individuals in the name of the group, without challenging the economic logic of a rent intensifying redevelopment at all. So the demand that we see Black Americans as a singular political entity motivated by unproblematically shared racial interests, is a class program, just as it was when in 1904, North Carolina Governor Charles Aycock, in reflecting on the objective of the violent 1898 Democratic putsch that led to mass disfranchisement and installed white supremacy, declared, "We need the strength which comes from believing alike." And of course, everything hinges on the specific content of the we, right? The second related problem I want to address concerning the race relations discourse and its premises, which, as Warren indicates, continue fundamentally to shape scholarly and popular thinking about Black politics, is the quintessential fact that at its very foundation, the race relations idea is racist. Right? I mean, I know that shouldn't seem like a turd in the punch bowl, but a lot of people seem to think it is, right? Races cannot relate because races are not real entities capable of willful activity. The notion that they are is the very definition of racism. Like if that's not racism, I don't know what it would be, right? To recognize this fact, what one might simply, as both Walter Ben Michaels and I have suggested quite independently of each other, substitute unicorn for race in all such constructs, and then see how it sounds, right? Social construction of unicorn. Well, no, what the hell is that? No, there are no unicorns. Punto. Okay. And only within that fundamentally racist framework can racial elite brokerage politics seem unproblematic. Again, the race relations idea depends on race reductionism, on assertion that discrete social characteristics or concerns of individuals or groups of people classified as Black are subordinate to their racial classification and to interests, issues, attitudes, or preferences that purportedly can be read out from that classification. This fact about race relations discourse should be obvious, but it's telling that that's unacknowledged in plain sight. At its origins, the race relations framework seems plausible for three reasons that no longer pertain. First, because that period was the apogee of the race idea. Talk about races engaging one another at a common sense quality it should not have now. Second, in the early 20th century, the great majority of Black people in the United States were disfranchised and severely hampered from expressing civic voice. And that opened space for strategically positioned, but ultimately self-selected individuals and groups to step into the breach to advocate for Black interests, which laid the basis for clientelist politics in the electoral realm as well. Finally, in the early 20th century, explicitly racial issues, lynching and pogroms, disfranchisement, denial of due process and equal standing before the law, overt discrimination and exclusion loomed so large that it was reasonable to assume that they were preeminently shared concerns among Black people. None of those conditions sets the contours of quotidian Black life, or definitively constrains aspirations and action now, or has during most of the last half century since the civil rights movement's great legislative victories. But the race relations framework and its clientelist and racial essentialist presumptions persist unmodified, in part because the key project of anti-racist politics is to propagate the view that race, in the form of disembodied abstractions like racism and the white supremacy, defines Black existence as thoroughly as it did in 1923 or 1823. The primacy of this project and its commitment to justifying a race reductionist politics with analogies to slavery and Jim Crow helps to make sense of how the reparations idea and its political entailments have taken hold in the new millennium. And that's also the answer to Professor Legette's anomaly. Thank you. I had more, but I think this is enough. Thank you very much for your patience.